The story starts with this young age boy, trained with the sword under a retired mercenary living in his village. The old man believed ink possessed remarkable potential. If someone that young could already fight that well, becoming a knight was within reach. From that moment on, a dream was born. The dream of becoming a knight capable of ending a war on his own. Carrying that ambition, he left his village behind. But fast forward to a tavern where a group of soldiers laughed at the rookie. They mocked him, wondering how someone so terrified could still dream of becoming a knight. That was the day he realized his talent was nothing special. Still, he wasn't the kind of person to quit. As time passed, he convinced himself that through relentless effort and constant training, he could overcome his limits. He continued cutting down monsters, gaining more combat experience with every battle. He believed he would eventually become the legendary End Knight, but everything changed with a single strike. Someone knocked his sword out of his hands and the blade's tip pressed against his stomach. In that instant, his dream fell apart, because the one who defeated him so effortlessly was only 12 years old and had just started learning swordsmanship, yet his natural talent completely overwhelmed him. That's when he realized all of his hard work seemed meaningless. He collapsed in despair, wondering if there was truly no path forward. But this was someone with an unbreakable will. The very next day, he returned to training, spending even more hours with the sword. He was basically Rock Lee with a blade, swinging at the same tree thousands upon thousands of times, until the metal itself began vibrating. Every sunrise meant picking up his sword once again and continuing his training. If he couldn't become the strongest, then he would become the most experienced. 3 years later, he had risen to become the commander of an ordinary squad. After dedicating his entire life to the sword, this was the highest rank he could achieve. Before the upcoming battle, he asked one of his comrades to spar with him because he knew a massive war was approaching. Thousands of soldiers would clash, and his squad was among the weakest. Moments later, the battlefield erupted with deafening screams and clashing steel. After cutting down an enemy lying on the ground, another soldier lunged toward his face. He quickly glanced sideways and narrowly dodged the attack. Another enemy rushed him from behind, but he blocked it with his shield. Then he spotted one of his teammates crying out in panic. He instantly realized an arrow was about to strike him from above, so he jumped in front and blocked it. His friend was still frozen in shock when another enemy charged from behind to stab him. The protagonist shoved his ally aside and beheaded the attacker in one clean swing. Then he heard the scream he had been waiting for. A body crashed onto the ground, followed by the sound of a sword cutting through the air. The man standing before him was the one he had to kill. Facing each other, he swore that this time he would defeat this enemy and finally survive. A memory flashed through his mind. One of his comrades had once told him that if he truly wanted to survive, he had to keep his eyes open, even when a weapon was already pressed against his neck. Like a wild beast, he shouldn't even understand what death meant, so he must never fear it until his final breath. The enemy thrust his sword straight toward him, and the protagonist watched death race closer, but instead of fearing it, he embraced it because death only made him stronger. He narrowly dodged the attack. For the first time, victory felt possible. He spun around to launch his counterattack, but his opponent suddenly shifted into an unusual sword grip and drove the blade straight through his throat. Blood burst from the wound as his body collapsed onto the ground. The next moment, he found himself beside a passing boat. Death told him to give up, accept his weakness, and quietly step aboard. But he simply smiled and declared that day would never come. At that moment, the loop began again. You see, that duel wasn't his first attempt, nor his second, or even his third. It was actually the 20th time he had died on that very battlefield. Even if he was the weakest soldier there, he was the only one who refused to accept death. The very first time he died and woke up again, he believed it had all been nothing more than déjà vu, a dream about losing his life on the battlefield. So he marched into the same war once again and died again. Then a second time, a third, and a fourth. Every morning began with the same soldier banging pots and pans, while the feeling of an enemy's blade piercing his body never left his mind. The same day repeated endlessly. He had no choice but to face that same swordsman over and over again. After dying for the 12th time, he got up and casually told his friend there were bugs inside his boots. Then the protagonist declared he would challenge it again. The story cuts back to the battlefield where he's already living his 33rd life. He dodges the familiar thrust once more, but as the enemy follows up, Incred tries to evade again. He's still too slow, and the blade slices through his throat. He collapses to his knees, and as his body falls, a necklace slips from around his neck. Incred remembers his days as a mercenary, when he hunted countless monsters. One day, a small village asked for his help, and he accepted because protecting the weak was what a true knight should do. Afterward, the village elder apologized for having nothing valuable to offer and handed him a small charm instead. For someone who had risked his life, it almost felt insulting, but the elder insisted it had the power to grant the wish of someone in absolute despair. Incred begins wondering if that very charm is the reason he's trapped reliving this day. The soldier who stabbed him remarks that he must be suffering and offers him a merciful death. The protagonist thinks, "Mercy my ass. It's obvious this guy enjoys killing me." Then the soldier finishes him off. Once again, the sound of clanging pots fills the air. This time he tells Rem that he was the one who put the bug in his own boot. Rem looks at him like he's lost his mind and asks if he's already gone crazy this early in the morning. The protagonist tells him to quit shouting and come outside because he wants to learn the heart of the beast. Rem swings his axe and Incred keeps his eyes locked on it before smoothly dodging aside. Rem is caught off guard, asking how he suddenly stopped flinching. The protagonist simply answers that he trained. Rem refuses to believe it, saying nobody changes that much overnight, and there's no way anyone else could have taught him his family's technique. Incred casually replies that he just happened to figure it out. Then he grabs a few weapons and asks Rem for a spar. Rem stares at him for a moment before grinning and agreeing. The duel begins, and Incred avoids every attack. After a while, Rem asks how long he plans on doing nothing but dodging. Even as Rem closes the distance, Incred slips past another swing. He explains that the only swordsmanship he knows is the Vulan mercenary style, the technique everyone calls nothing more than a cheap trick. Incred begins losing his balance, and Rem immediately takes advantage of the opening. The protagonist regains his footing just in time and prepares for the incoming leap. Rem notices the movement, and just like the soldier Incred always faces, the timing feels identical. The protagonist thrusts his sword toward Rem, but Rem smacks it right out of his hands. The sword slides across the ground, and Incred realizes that even if only for a brief moment, he managed to imitate that bastard's thrust. He says his body has already memorized the movement. Rem tells him that attack should have drawn blood. Out of everything the protagonist has shown so far, that thrust was actually impressive. Rem even starts giving him advice on how to refine it. He warns Incred that if he keeps doubting himself, he'll never improve. Instead, he needs to focus entirely on the next move instead of his own fear. That's how a swordsman keeps hold of his blade, even if Rem explains it in his own rough way. The protagonist looks at him and says that messy explanation somehow made perfect sense. The real difference between his thrust and the soldier's wasn't technique, it was confidence. Incred never truly trusted his own sword, and once again, the soldier kills him. Talking about mercy yet again, the man drives his blade straight into him. Then it's back to training with Rem, who sends his sword flying once more. The soldier kills Incred again, and once again, he returns to sparring with Rem. He vows to keep enduring this merciless loop one step at a time, no matter how small those steps may be. He dies again, and by now, he's already reached his 111th life, yet it still isn't enough. Then the story jumps to his 123rd life, where the enemy's sword is once again pressed against his throat. During the next training session, Incred charges at Rem with a shout, and this time his thrust actually forces Rem's axe backward, using the very same attack that had killed him countless times. Rem stares at him in disbelief and asks if he's gone insane. Incred's hand begins pouring blood, and Rem points out how badly it's bleeding. He can't understand why the protagonist is laughing like a madman, but Incred can't hide his excitement. He had finally mastered that thrust. Now he's back on the battlefield, standing before the enemy he despises the most. The protagonist launches his thrust, and now that he's learned the technique, his blade scrapes across the soldier's helmet. The enemy counters with his own thrust, and the sword still pierces straight through Incred's throat. His very first exchange using the technique ended in failure, but this time he refused to blink or loosen his grip. He collapsed to the ground with his sword still tightly gripped in his hand. The soldier stepped onto his chest with a grin, commenting on how much pain he seemed to be in. Then he repeated that same line about showing mercy, but Incred glared back and muttered, "Tomorrow. Tomorrow I'll kill you." The soldier laughed, saying the dead never get a tomorrow, before ending his life once again. Back at camp, A bug crawled out of Rem's boot, but Ingrid crushed it before it could escape. He casually mentioned that he had seen it crawl inside earlier. Rem thanked him, and the protagonist replied that if he was really grateful, he could take over his guard duty. Rem stared at him, wondering why he was giving orders so casually. Soon, another squad member named Big Eyes appeared. Ingrid immediately told him to bring a shield, a suit of armor, and a dagger, promising he'd pay him back later. Big Eyes looked stunned, but agreed since Ingrid was still his commander. Rem couldn't help asking if he'd always been this bossy, and Ingrid answered that everyone usually dumped their work on him anyway. More members of the squad gathered around, and Rem pointed out that the protagonist had been acting unusually strange all day. He was never normally this tense. Before long, Ingrid was back at the tree, repeatedly driving his sword into the trunk. He reflected that every single death had brought unimaginable pain. Then he wondered what would happen if he still couldn't win after tens of thousands of attempts. Would running away finally allow tomorrow to arrive? Or would this same day continue forever? For a brief moment, he even considered accepting the strength he had already gained, but he immediately rejected the thought, telling himself to stop acting so weak. He refused to give up. He would break through this wall no matter what and discover what lay beyond it. With that resolve, he stabbed the tree again and again, swearing he would never waste this chance to repeat his life. Eventually, the tree split cleanly in half. Afterward, he equipped all of his gear and prepared for battle, completely convinced that today would be different. The war horn echoed across the battlefield as Ingrid led his squad into combat. As the fighting erupted, he reminded himself that the only reason he'd survived this long was because of luck, preparation, and staying calm. An enemy attacked from behind, but Ingrid blocked the strike before beheading him. Another aimed for his leg, but his shin guard absorbed the blow, allowing him to crush the attacker's skull. A third soldier hurled an axe from behind, but the protagonist dodged it before throwing his own weapon straight back. He knew he could only react this well because he had lived through this battlefield countless times. Spotting Krang screaming nearby, he rushed over and blocked the arrow meant for him, just as he had done in previous loops. Then he swiftly killed the attacker. Now the true obstacle stood before him. The soldier locked eyes with him, and the two stared each other down in complete silence before the enemy suddenly charged. Ingrid blocked the attack, but his shield shattered from the impact. Tossing the broken shield aside, he stepped forward and caught the next strike with his sword. The protagonist realized that while the soldier possessed extraordinary talent and was practically a prodigy, he lacked genuine battlefield experience, making him vulnerable to unexpected tactics. Ingrid slammed his forehead straight into the man's face. That was exactly why the Vulan mercenary sword style, filled with dirty tricks, worked so well here. He scooped up a handful of dirt with his boot and kicked it directly into the soldier's eyes. As the enemy staggered in panic, Ingrid closed the distance. The soldier reacted instinctively and thrust his blade forward, but the protagonist slipped cleanly past it. The soldier landed and immediately spun around to continue his attack, but Ingrid was ready. By now, he knew every detail of that thrust. His sword crashed against the enemy's blade and shattered it completely. At that very moment, an archer pulled back his bow and released an arrow across the battlefield. The soldier dropped the remains of his broken sword as Ingrid rushed in for the finishing blow. He thought victory was finally his, but the arrow was still racing toward him. Just before it struck, an axe smashed it out of the air, and Ingrid drove his sword straight through the soldier's throat. Rem had blocked the arrow. He shouted that he'd go deal with the archer, but Krang told him not to waste his strength. The defeated soldier slowly collapsed, still unable to believe what had happened. As he looked across the battlefield, he dropped to his knees. Ingrid stood over him and noticed the once confident warrior trembling in fear. Raising his sword, he quietly declared, "This is mercy." Before cutting off the soldier's head, Ingrid smiled. At long last, he had overcome the wall that had stopped him for so long. But before he could celebrate, someone kicked him hard in the back. A man with a ponytail stood behind him. Ingrid groaned in pain as Rem rushed over, shouting that it was a frog. The ponytailed attacker was a frogman. Looking down at the fallen protagonist, the frogman complained that he had invested so much into that soldier and couldn't believe he had lost. Apparently, that soldier's nickname was Pervert. The frogman swung his weapon while shouting for Ingrid to die, but Rem stepped in and blocked the attack with his axe. Rem immediately brought his axe down in a powerful strike, but the frogman stopped it. The two warriors closed the distance and began exchanging blow after blow. Another enemy rushed in to finish off Ingrid, but Krang stepped in first and beheaded him. Rem leaped backward and the frogman did the same. Both of them paused for a moment before Rem smirked and said that if the frogman wanted to kill his squad leader, he'd need permission first. The frogman looked at Encred in confusion and asked how someone that weak had become commander instead of him. Rem explained that frogs were born for battle, and the only reliable ways to kill one were to burn it with magic or take it down with a single clean strike. The frogman studied Rem carefully, wondering why someone of his caliber was fighting on such a small battlefield. After weighing the situation, he decided that killing Rem would cost him his own life as well. It simply wasn't worth it. So he turned around and walked away. Rem called him a coward as he left. Krang carried the wounded Encred away while Rem stood his ground, blocking every soldier that tried to pursue them. Another enemy attempted to chase after them, but another member of their squad intercepted him. Soon, yet another ally arrived, cutting down an entire line of enemy soldiers. Encred's vision gradually became blurry, and when the order to retreat echoed across the battlefield, he closed his eyes as his squad withdrew. Before long, he found himself in the underworld once again. The boatman remarked that he had managed to survive one more day, but only one. Eventually, the walls standing in his way would become impossible to overcome. According to fate, he was destined to give up and sink into despair. Encred slowly stood up, glanced at the massive wall behind him, and calmly told the boatman that those walls existed only so he could overcome them. The boatman smiled and replied that he would patiently wait for the day. The greed and ambition burning in Encred's eyes finally faded into darkness. Encred woke up wrapped in bandages. Rem told him he was in the infirmary tent and had been unconscious for 2 full days. He explained that he was the one who saved him from the frogman. The protagonist looked genuinely shocked, saying that if it really had been a frog, he couldn't believe he had actually survived. Rem then asked if Encred remembered calling him his best friend. The protagonist immediately denied ever calling them friends before accidentally blurting out that Rem was a noble hunter. Rem instantly covered his mouth and nervously looked around to make sure nobody had overheard. He scolded Encred, saying he couldn't just go around shouting other people's secrets when they had nothing to do with him. Then Rem sighed, saying he honestly thought they had become best friends. At that moment, Encred finally realized he had truly escaped that cursed day. They also revealed that Big Eye's real name was Chris. Chris reminded the protagonist that he now owed him 3 times the amount he had spent. Encred wondered why Chris was even there since he hadn't been anywhere near the battlefield. Chris simply smiled and joked that he'd settle for only double the debt as a special discount. Soon after, Krang entered the infirmary as well. Encred asked what he wanted and Krang casually tossed him a bottle, telling him to use it every morning and every night. The protagonist remembered that Krang hated sharing anything that belonged to him, making the gesture surprisingly meaningful. They also introduced the tall monk, whose name was Odin. He sat there crying while quietly praying. Encred told him he was still alive, so he could stop worrying and leave already. That night, the protagonist wondered why everyone kept taking turns staying by his bedside. Were they actually concerned about him? Then another squad member entered the tent. The moment he spotted Encred, he looked surprised and asked why he was lying in the infirmary. It was Ragnar. Almost immediately, he backed right back out, making Encred think there was no way Ragnar had come because he was worried. He was usually far too carefree for that. Besides Ragnar, there were 2 other soldiers inside the tent. One was a platoon commander who constantly picked fights with Encred, while the other was a soldier he had never seen before, silently staring into empty space. Encred couldn't help wondering why that man was there. Suddenly, they heard footsteps approaching from outside. Everyone turned as a long-haired elf woman entered and asked who commanded the 444th Squad. Encred looked confused while the other platoon commander immediately referred to her as a fairy. She calmly asked which unit he belonged to, and he introduced himself as Vanzinto, 3rd platoon commander of the 2nd company. She questioned whether his company had really trained him to greet people by pointing out their race first. Embarrassed, he quickly apologized. Encred realized she must be the newly appointed commander of the 4th Company. He then stepped forward and introduced himself as the squad commander she was looking for. She replied that she had heard he was managing his troublesome squad quite well and expected great things from him moving forward. The protagonist was surprised she had come all the way there just to say that. As she turned to leave, she asked the young soldier for his name. He answered, Krang, although his response sounded oddly suspicious. Encred couldn't help wondering if he had just made that name up on the spot. Judging by his attitude, He even started questioning whether Krang might secretly be a noble. Before leaving, the commander gave Encred one final glance. He had absolutely no idea what was going on. Later, he noticed that most of the pain had faded and started wondering if it was already time to resume training. Vancinto asked where he thought he was going, and Encred answered that he was heading to the training grounds. Vancinto called him an idiot, saying that a bottom-ranked soldier shouldn't try so hard to act tough. The noble remained completely silent. The protagonist tells himself he needs to replay the previous battle in his mind, learning that skill had cost him dearly when he was younger. As he reflects on his final attack failing, he realizes putting everything into a single strike is far too dangerous. He compares it to the way every one of Rim's attacks is meant to kill. Just then, the noble from the infirmary comments that he's been training hard. Caught by surprise, Encred admits he doesn't completely understand it himself. His hands kept twitching while he was in the barracks, and now he keeps drifting off into thought. He explains that he's been strengthening his grip while mentally replaying the battle. When the noble asks why he goes that far, Encred simply answers that it's to stay alive. The noble then asks if surviving is only a step toward becoming something greater. The protagonist hesitates because every time he shares his dream, people laugh at him. Even so, he looks up, raises his sword, and quietly says he wants to become a knight. The noble is visibly surprised, and Encred realizes it's the first time someone has heard that dream without mocking him. The man says he had forgotten something important, but hearing those words reminded him. Now he knows exactly what he has to do. As he walks away, he tells Encred that if he truly becomes a knight someday, he should remember his name. Back at camp, a bard performs while the soldiers chat about Cyprus, the hero of the recent battle. Vancinto grumbles about breakfast, complaining that it seems like they're planning to feed them nothing. Instead of heading to train, Encred goes for a walk, where Jackson asks how his injuries are healing. The protagonist replies that the medicine worked perfectly and thanks him for it. Jackson smiles and says that if he's really thankful, he should hurry back. That evening, the noble wishes him good night, and Encred returns the greeting. Vancinto wants absolutely nothing to do with the conversation. Encred starts thinking that the entire day passed without anything meaningful happening. Then he hears the bard singing again and suddenly wonders if he'd also been there that morning. At that moment, Vancinto repeats the exact same complaint about the morning rations. That's when Encred finally understands what is happening. He bolts upright in shock, muttering, "This can't be happening." Jackson asks about his injuries again, and Encred gives him the exact same answer as before, only to receive the exact same response in return. That confirms it. He's trapped in another loop. He remembers what the boatmen said about the next wall waiting for him. Then Encred starts wondering if he somehow died in his sleep without even realizing it. He admits that this feels even worse than dying on the battlefield, but instead of breaking him, it strengthens his resolve. Another trial has appeared before him, and he intends to overcome it. That night, he tries to figure out who killed him and why. The only person capable of entering the barracks unnoticed should be a knight, leading him to suspect there's an assassin hiding among them. He recalls the commander mentioning that fairies are naturally light and swift, making them perfect assassins. That makes him question whether her earlier visit had simply been reconnaissance. He decides he has to confirm it. Since there's only one entrance to the barracks, spotting her would let him raise the alarm and wake everyone. All he has to do is wait for the assassin to appear. Suddenly, a needle pierces his throat. He turns around in shock. He never sensed anyone approaching. Pain shoots through his body, and all he can manage is a muffled gasp before collapsing from the bed. He quickly realizes the needle was coated with a numbing poison. Looking over, he sees Vancinto with another needle lodged in his throat. Someone is also standing over Krang. At last, Encred catches sight of the assassin as she raises her blade above Krang before driving it straight into him, killing him instantly. Then another figure slices through the tent from outside. A second assassin. Looking up, Encred sees the company commander herself and immediately realizes the truth. It really was her, the commander of the 4th Company. He wakes once more to the bard's familiar song, realizing this is already his 3rd attempt. He still hasn't been able to detect the assassins at all, meaning this challenge won't be easy, and with the company commander personally involved, stopping the first assassin won't change anything. There's no way he can defeat her afterward. For the first time in a while, he feels completely helpless. The feeling reminds him of facing Pervert only a few days earlier. Yet he had eventually found a way to overcome him. If he keeps trying, he'll discover another path to victory. He suddenly yanks the blanket off Vancinto, who immediately snaps, asking if he's gone insane. Incred tells him he was wrong to focus only on what was happening inside the camp. They also have to prepare for attacks coming from outside. Vincento sarcastically asks if today's training is going to involve hunting cockroaches, saying a lowly soldier like Incred is perfectly suited for that. The protagonist simply smiles and says he's happy that Vincento cares so much. That only irritates Vincento even more because he had been mocking him the entire time. The protagonist sighs and says he thought so too. Krang asks if they're arguing again and jokes that maybe he should come back later. Incred tells him it's fine and Vincento simply lies back down. Incred says that Krang is obviously the real target, making him wonder who he really is because something about him has always felt unusual. Even so, he doesn't want to dig into Krang's past if Krang doesn't want to talk about it, just as he respects the secrets of everyone else in his squad. But now Krang has been dragged into this as well, so Incred decides to ask him directly what he really is. Krang freezes on the spot, and the protagonist immediately wonders if he phrased the question the wrong way. After an awkward pause, Krang says it's not something he can explain. Incred asks why, and Krang simply replies that it's a long story. The protagonist thinks for a moment before nodding and saying that makes sense. Vincento immediately loses his temper, asking why he'd accept such a terrible answer if he was just going to let it go. Why bother asking in the first place? He adds that Krang obviously isn't from this kingdom based on his manners and asks which country's spy he really is. Krang silently stares at him, causing Vincento to stop talking. Krang steps forward and firmly declares that he is not, nor will he ever become, someone who betrays the kingdom. Vincento studies him for a moment before admitting he can tell from Krang's eyes and the way he carries himself that he possesses something resembling a knight's presence. Then he quickly asks if that's any way to speak to a superior. Krang laughs and Incred remarks that he can't be a true knight since he was just as powerless against the assassin as everyone else. Still, there's no doubt Krang is hiding something. That night, everyone exchanges goodnights once again, and even Vincento clears his throat as if he's joining in. Incred wonders if that's because he's actually intimidated by Krang. He keeps watching the entrance to the tent, thinking that if the assassins charge in, they'll all die. Sitting upright, he catches Vincento asking why he's still awake instead of sleeping. Incred warns him that assassins will be arriving soon, so he'd better help if he wants to survive. Vincento gives him a disgusted look and says he's completely lost his mind. Krang quietly smiles at the exchange, and the protagonist thinks that reaction was exactly what he expected. Suddenly, a voice asks how he knew. Before he can react, a poison needle shoots through the tent wall and pierces his throat. Incred is stunned. The assassins were already inside. He reaches for his sword, but one assassin rushes in and kills Vincento before stabbing Krang through the chest. Moments later, Incred dies as well. He awakens for the fourth time and realizes that without proof, nobody will believe his warnings about the assassins. He tries reporting everything to his superiors, but one of them immediately tells him to shut up and leave. Next, the protagonist decides he'll predict the exact moment the assassins strike. Then he hears a scream, notices the tent flap shifting with the wind, and wonders if this is the moment. He shouts, "Assassins!" but a blade still pierces his throat. The weapon is pulled free, and blood pours from the wound. Only then do the assassins rush through the front entrance. After experiencing it again, Incred realizes he has to strike first before they can make their move. The problem is figuring out how to fight enemies he can't even detect. During the next loop, he stands guard inside the tent once more, but once again, a poison needle comes from behind and pierces his throat. He realizes none of his plans matter unless he first finds a way to avoid those poison needles. By the 20th loop, he still can't do anything against them. Then he suddenly pauses and smirks. He's only died 20 times so far. First, he needs to solve the problem of the poison needle. Spotting Jackson nearby cleaning his dagger, Incred walks over. This man is the key. He asks Rem why everyone calls Jackson the perverted wildcat. Rem replies that it's because Jackson is a complete pervert who always attacks from behind before disappearing, just like a sneaky wildcat. Jackson notices Incred approaching and asks whether his injuries have healed. Incred immediately realizes Jackson would probably have no trouble defeating those assassins, but bringing him along isn't an option. He doesn't have the authority to order Jackson around, and besides, this is a wall he has to overcome himself. So instead, He asks what someone would need to do to stop themselves from being assassinated. Jackson thinks for a moment before admitting he has no idea because nobody has ever survived one of his ambushes. That answer convinces Incred he's asking exactly the right person, so he asks another question. If someone like Jackson attacked him from behind, how could he possibly stop it? Jackson considers it again and gives the same answer. Nobody has ever lived through something like that. Even so, Incred refuses to give up searching for an answer. Jackson keeps thinking before finally letting out a long sigh and saying Incred would need eyes on the back of his head. The protagonist asks what that's supposed to mean. Jackson smiles, says the timing is perfect, and asks whether Incred notices the wagon behind him. Confused, the protagonist asks where, and Jackson points toward the area behind the tents. Incred wonders how Jackson noticed something that far away, asking if he really has eyes on the back of his head. Jackson points at the wagon and says it's about to fall apart. Moments later, the wheel comes loose and the wagon tips over. The protagonist is stunned, asking if Jackson can actually see the future. Jackson shakes his head and says he's just spent too much time around that barbarian. When Incred tells him to stop joking and explain, Jackson finally does. He points to his ear and says it's all about sound. He heard the wagon's axle creaking. If you can hear everything happening around you, you can predict what comes next. Incred is amazed because he hadn't even noticed the wagon at all. Jackson explains that you don't need your eyes to sense your surroundings. You have to keep listening. Sharpen your senses and learn to isolate one sound from countless others. The protagonist admits that was actually a great explanation, especially since Jackson used to be too lazy to answer any of his questions. Jackson replies that's simply the way he is. Even so, helping him like this is still better than having Incred constantly following him around. Besides, lately, the protagonist has become far too stubborn to give up anyway. That night, Incred lies awake in bed and says he's reached his second wall, death without a face. If he can sense the assassin before the attack comes, he'll survive. So he focuses entirely on his hearing, picking up the patrol's footsteps and the crackling of the torches outside. The assassin rushes in, but Incred still hears nothing. He desperately wonders where the attack is coming from. The assassin lands nearby, yet he still can't detect a single sound. Then the assassin vanishes. A poison needle suddenly pierces Incred's throat. He opens his eyes in frustration, already knowing he failed once again. The following morning, he wakes to the same song praising Cypress. He realizes he hasn't made any progress at all, but his body remembers every attempt. It remembers drawing out the beast's heart and the feeling of that deadly thrust. Jackson explains that sound reveals more than people realize. From its volume and direction, you can tell exactly where something is. Once you're able to catch faint noises from far away, your ears begin functioning like another pair of eyes. Snapping his fingers, Jackson explains that sound is simply a wave spreading in every direction, even when it's incredibly quiet. That means with thousands of sounds colliding together, Incred has to separate one wave from the rest. The protagonist starts catching fragments of everyone's conversations and quickly realizes how tangled all the sounds have become. He needs to sort them apart one by one. He notices that all the flags fluttering together sound like one giant flag, then tries to remember how many flags are actually there before shifting his attention to the nearby footsteps and carefully mapping every sound around him. He begins with familiar noises before gradually moving on to the unfamiliar ones. Krang suddenly calls him NT, causing Incred to open his eyes as Krang asks what kind of training this is supposed to be. The protagonist questions the nickname and Krang casually explains that it's just a shortened version of his name. Incred doesn't like it, but decides to let it slide. Then he asks what part of silently sitting there is supposed to look like training. Krang smiles and says he already knows Incred isn't the type to waste his time on pointless things. That night, another poison needle flies toward him and strikes his throat. He turns just in time to see Krang stabbed through the stomach. The assassin attacks again, making Krang cough up blood. By now, Incred has reached his 33rd loop, and the 34th ends exactly the same way. He still hears absolutely nothing, and Krang dies again. The cycle repeats over and over. Incred continues sitting in silence, forcing himself to listen. He tells himself this wall won't be broken through experience alone. There won't be a miracle or a sudden revelation. The only answer is to repeat it again and again until he can finally hear the bird. A bird lands on top of one of the flags, and this time he hears it. If he can detect something that subtle, then hearing the assassin's footsteps should also be possible. He opens his eyes and sees Krang, who says he's surprised Incred didn't notice him sneaking over. Krang points out that he'd been standing there for quite a while and guesses the protagonist is training his senses. After all, Incred isn't someone who wastes his time. There's something different in the protagonist's eyes now. The assassin raises his arm and throws a poison needle straight at Incred's throat, but this time he dodges it. He instantly grabs the blade hidden beneath his pillow and slashes back, knocking the assassin off balance. The attacker panics, stumbles, and crashes to the ground. Sweat begins pouring down the assassin's face as Incred grins and says, "You're not some faceless death anymore." The assassin grits his teeth and charges at Incred, calling him a filthy rat. The protagonist immediately realizes this assassin isn't as skilled as Pervert, meaning he actually has a chance of winning. He quickly glances toward the others and sees Vincento already lying there with a poison needle in his throat, but Krang is still alive. The assassin attacks again, and Incred dodges while reminding himself not to let his guard down, just because his opponent isn't an elite killer. Suddenly, a dagger flies toward him. He barely avoids a fatal hit, but the blade still slices across his chest. Seeing the opening, the assassin rushes in without hesitation. At that moment, the tent is slashed open. Incred looks over, spots the company commander, and instantly realizes that if he doesn't strike first, he'll die. He thrusts his sword toward her. The assassin shouts that the protagonist has a guard and scatters poison needles in every direction. Incred turns, but it's already too late to stop the needles from flying toward Krang as well. The company commander leaps over Incred's attack and spreads her cape, blocking every poison needle. That's when he realizes she never came to kill him. She came to protect him. Either way, this is the opportunity he's been waiting for. Dropping low, he lunges straight at the assassin. The assassin tries to defend himself, but the force of the blow knocks his weapons aside. Grinding his teeth, he immediately decides to retreat. He knows he has to escape while he still can. Incred doesn't bother chasing him. He simply watches in disbelief, unable to believe the assassin actually ran away. Krang slowly sits up and says the assassin was most likely targeting him. The protagonist replies that he already knows. Krang asks how he figured that out, and Incred explains that no one would waste an assassin on nobodies like him or Vincento. The company commander nods in agreement, impressed by how quickly he reached that conclusion. As her hand slowly moves toward the hilt of her sword, Incred immediately understands the situation. Even though she protected them, she can't allow anyone to learn what happened here. She intends to eliminate every witness. Tightening his grip on his sword, he prepares himself. But before either of them can move, Krang steps between them and asks the commander for a favor. He calmly says that he doesn't want anyone dying today. Incred has absolutely no idea what's going on. The commander bows respectfully and answers, "As you wish." Krang then adds that his request includes Vincento, since he isn't dead yet. She explains they have an antidote so he'll survive. The protagonist realizes she must know poisons incredibly well if she can identify one with a single glance. The commander says they need to clean up everything because it would become a serious problem if word spread that an assassin had infiltrated the camp. Incred asks whether simply leaving no evidence would be enough. Then he notices the nearby fire and says there's an easy solution. Moments later, the entire tent is engulfed in flames. Soldiers rush over carrying buckets, shouting that the infirmary is on fire, while reporting that there are 2 survivors inside. Incred quietly remarks that this way every trace of the assassin disappears, and everything else will take care of itself. Later, Krang stands beside the company commander. She tells him that if Incred hadn't slowed the assassin down, Krang would have died. She then asks if that's why he changed his mind. Krang answers yes, before asking if she agrees that Incred is an interesting person. Instead of replying, she simply looks away. Krang admits he'd been trying to avoid getting involved, but then he remembers watching Incred train relentlessly every single morning. Smiling to himself, he says the protagonist's determination must have rubbed off on him. He says they'll meet again someday, each carrying their own role. A massive scythe suddenly rises from the water before fading away, revealing the boatman once again. The boatman tells Incred they'll meet again, and Incred calmly replies, "Anytime." He reflects that he managed to overcome the second wall and finally woke up to the next day. Although he can now sense most things around him, he still couldn't detect the company commander, proving he still has a long road ahead. Incred adds that fortunately, his injuries weren't too severe, so he can return immediately. Vincento then asks if Incred was the one who saved him from the fire and demands to know why. The protagonist wonders why he's getting attitude after saving his life and why Vincento seems to hate him so much. Incred simply answers that it's because they're comrades. He doesn't need any other reason. Vincento looks away with a hint of guilt and admits that after everything he's done to Incred, that answer is far too selfless. Then he asks if the protagonist is heading back to his squad. Incred says he is, but Vincento warns him he's out of luck because the atmosphere over there is terrible. Curious, Incred asks why. Vincento explains that rumors have spread throughout the camp that the entire base is cursed. Just then, someone from Incred's squad shouts at Rem, calling him an underdeveloped monkey before shoving him. Rem looks absolutely delighted, while everyone nearby starts running away, yelling that the squad is fighting again. Rem grabs the man, lifts him into the air, and slams him onto a table. The soldier swings back, but Rem effortlessly dodges before landing a powerful punch straight to his face. Then he pulls out both of his axes and declares that he'll decorate the man's skull with them. The other soldier draws his sword and shouts that he'll cut Rem in half. Incred finally arrives and sighs, saying maybe the camp really is cursed because these idiots certainly feel like his personal curse. He tells them to knock it off. They reply that they thought he had died, and the protagonist answers that he didn't, but they might end up driving him insane instead. 4 days after returning to his squad, he's sleeping when he suddenly opens his eyes to find Jackson standing over him. Jackson says he was trying to leave quietly and asks if he accidentally woke him. Incred replies that he didn't because he was about to get up for training anyway. Jackson comments that the protagonist only started recently, but he's already become an excellent listener. Incred says he's been working hard at it, and Jackson tells him to keep improving because that skill will help him someday. Since there aren't many battles lately and winter is approaching, Jackson says the best thing he can do is devote himself completely to training his body, while doing one-arm pull-ups on a tree with a massive boulder attached. Someone greets him. Incred looks down and notices only a giant rock at first, but underneath it is Odd. Odd asks if he's coming back from morning training and remarks that he's been keeping himself busy. The protagonist drops the boulder and says that kind of training suits him just fine. Odd slowly stands up, towering over Incred, and says a well-trained body is a weapon all by itself. A proper body should even be able to withstand a kick from a frog, but Incred is still far too skinny, so he needs to keep training. The protagonist laughs, saying Odd is just ridiculously huge, but he'll give it his best shot. Odd starts explaining the training method he mentioned before, but the conversation is interrupted by shouting from the neighboring tent. Rem is dragging out the same soldier he fought earlier, saying it's his duty and calling him lazy for still sleeping. The man crawls toward his sword, grabs it, and swings while yelling at Rem to eat his ass. Rem immediately swings back, and Incred rushes over asking why they're fighting again. Odd calmly tells them that violence solves nothing. Rem points at the other soldier and says this idiot is trying to starve everyone. The protagonist replies that if it's his turn to cook, then he should just do it. Ragna reluctantly agrees. Rem tries handing him an apron, saying there was no reason for all this if he was going to cook anyway. Ragna knocks the apron away, complaining that it stinks. Rem sniffs it himself and insists it smells perfectly fine. Incred asks Rem if he's really so bored that he's starting fights over nothing. Rem admits it's that obvious and says the lack of battles is driving him crazy. The protagonist tells him to stop bullying random people and fight him instead. Later that day, Rem kicks Incred hard in the side and tells him he needs to learn how to take hits better before charging in again with his axe and knocking the protagonist's weapon away. Incred steadies himself using the heart of the beast. When Rem attacks again, he knocks the strike aside while reminding himself to use his hearing to read incoming attacks. Applying everything he learned through hundreds of deaths, he thrusts his sword toward Rem's face. Rem dodges with ease, though he admits it was a respectable attempt. Then he catches Incred's sword with his axe, locks it in place, grabs him by the collar, and uses the protagonist's own momentum to slam him into the ground. Rem says he expected more after Incred's recent improvement. Still, he asks why the protagonist suddenly feels dull. He's already seen that same thrust countless times, so what else does he have? Incred slowly gets back to his feet and says he knows he's changed. He can repeat the same action hundreds of thousands of times if he has to. Locking eyes with Rem, he tells him to come again because this time he'll crush him. Rem thinks to himself that even if Incred's skills are still lacking, he'll never get tired of seeing that stubborn determination in his eyes. A wide grin spreads across his face as he tells Incred he can talk that big after landing even a single hit. Just then, rain suddenly begins pouring from the sky. Both of them instinctively look up, caught completely off guard by how quickly it started. Back inside the tent, Incred remarks that the rain comes and goes whenever it pleases. Rem jokes that at this rate mushrooms are going to start growing on his feet. Ragna is fast asleep while Odd quietly prays nearby. Another soldier walks into the tent, complaining about how many duels he's had to cancel because of the rain. He says he's almost starting to believe the rumors about the curse. Incred asks what he's talking about, and the man asks if he really hasn't heard. After thinking for a moment, Incred recalls that Vincento mentioned something similar before. The soldier explains that the weather has become unusually strange, casualties are increasing, and people keep getting injured, especially Jackson and Ragna, who are both currently wounded. Because of everything happening, rumors have spread that the entire camp is cursed. He personally doesn't believe it, but the bizarre weather has only made the rumors spread even faster. Incred remarks that the higher-ups won't simply ignore something like this. The man asks why he's standing outside in the pouring rain, and the protagonist replies that that's exactly the point. Rem asks if he's some kind of stray cat and wonders what this training is even supposed to accomplish. Jackson, however, says it's actually a solid idea and encourages Incred to keep at it. Rem just scoffs before shouting across the camp, demanding to know what Jackson has been teaching him and asking since when he started caring about the squad leader. As the argument begins, Odd calmly says there are plenty of ways to train inside the tent even while lying down. Ragna offers to check Incred's stance again. Rem points at all of them and says, "Just look at these guys." Everyone keeps staring at Incred. Jackson glances over. Odd smiles, and Ragna continues watching the protagonist's back. Rem points out that Incred has been constantly looking outside the tent. Elsewhere, inside the war room, a commander orders everyone to keep their soldiers under control. He explains that they need another scouting mission before winter arrives, and asks for suggestions to fill the vacant positions. The ferry commander recommends the leader of the 444th Squad. One of the officers immediately objects, saying Incred is too foolish and would only slow the scouts down. She argues that he might produce unexpected results, and when asked why she believes that, she simply replies that it's a ferry's instinct. The next day, Incred meets with her and asks why he's being assigned to the scouting unit. She simply stares at him without answering. The story then cuts back to the officer from earlier, who asks if Incred somehow offended the company commander. Incred asks what he could possibly have done, and the officer insists he must have done something. Otherwise, why would she choose him specifically? The protagonist quietly wonders if she's planning to kill him now that Krang is gone. Rem asks whether he's really going and says he can help him avoid the order while gripping his axe. Incred replies that he can't exactly threaten a superior with an axe, and unlike Rem, he wouldn't even consider it. Rem quickly says that's not what he meant, and Incred warns him not to do anything reckless either, especially considering his history of violence. Odd prays that Incred won't be taken away and wonders what is wrong with everyone around him. Ragna suddenly sits up and offers to go instead. The others give him strange looks because everyone knows he gets lost far too easily. Jackson tells Incred that when scouting through tall grass, he should pay attention to changes in the blades and look for signs that they've been disturbed. That's the first step toward avoiding an ambush. Rem interrupts, complaining that he already told Jackson to stop teaching the protagonist all this weird stuff. Incred sighs to himself, realizing that once he leaves, nobody will be around to stop those two from fighting. He wonders if it's really okay to leave them behind, but even he knows there's nobody more suitable for this assignment than himself. Ever since joining the army, his lack of natural talent caused him to be transferred from one position to another. This squad was the first place where he truly felt needed. Just as Jackson and Rem move to attack each other, Incred suddenly steps between them, catching both of them completely off guard and stopping their attacks. He calmly tells them to knock it off. Rem asks whether he's brave or simply stupid, while Jackson remarks that he should be grateful because otherwise he would have ended up with a hole in his chest. Incred replies that both of them are far too skilled to lose to each other, and compared to their strength, his own absence wouldn't reduce the squad's combat power by much. This isn't some emotional farewell. He knows exactly where he stands, and he also knows he still has a long way to go. Before long, he heads into the forest with the scouting unit, making their way toward the front lines. One of the scouts notices Incred walking with his eyes closed and tells him to pay attention. He explains that although they share the same rank, he's the leader of the scouting squad, and if Incred has a problem with that, they can settle it in a fight. His name is Andrew. Another scout laughs and asks Andrew if he seriously thought the protagonist would challenge him, mocking Incred as an outcast. Andrew smirks and says that if Incred does try, he'll make sure not to hurt him too badly. Then he shouts at everyone that a squad is only as strong as its men, and if they run into the enemy, they'll crush their skulls. The protagonist quietly comments that they're far too loud and wonders if they even understand what scouting is supposed to be. In his opinion, Andrew is still far too inexperienced for this kind of mission. Eventually, they discover fresh tracks on the ground. Andrew immediately declares they're enemy tracks and decides they'll follow them so they can enjoy a barbecue tonight. Ingrid points out that gnolls usually travel in groups of at least 20. If Andrew really intends to attack them, what exactly is he thinking? Another scout bursts into laughter and explains those aren't gnoll tracks at all. They belong to a gazelle. Noticing Ingrid staring at him, the man smiles and says Andrew can be pretty annoying sometimes. He introduces himself as Enri. Enri used to work as a hunter and didn't think much of Ingrid at first, but after the two happened to talk one day, they gradually became close friends. Enri begins teaching Ingrid the basics of being a hunter, which proves incredibly helpful. He explains that animals usually create separate trails as they move through the fields. Promising to teach him more the next day, they call it a night. Meanwhile, Andrew keeps insisting those tracks definitely weren't gnoll tracks and says results matter more than anything else, while Ingrid quietly watches him. The following day, the squad sets out again. As they arrive at the fields, Andrew explains that this is their assigned scouting area, Green Pearl, also known as the absurdly tall grass field. He declares that they'll cross the field, locate the enemy force, and bring prisoners back alive. The soldiers respond in unison before moving forward. As they advance, Ingrid asked if they're really entering the field when their mission is only reconnaissance. Andrew simply replies that it's the squad leader's order. Pushing through the towering grass, the protagonist realizes this mission won't be easy. He expected Andrew to lose interest quickly, but surprisingly, he doesn't. At the very least, Andrew is taking the assignment seriously. As they continue, Ingrid notices there's barely any animal droppings around and asks if that's a bad sign. Enri immediately answers yes. If food is plentiful, but there aren't any animals nearby, then something is definitely wrong. Suddenly, a massive paw crashes into the ground. A chill runs through Ingrid's body as a panther races through the grass beside him. Their eyes meet for a split second, and the protagonist instantly shoves Andrew's head downward, warning everyone to stay low. The panther isn't hunting them. It's fleeing from something even more dangerous. A heartbeat later, two soldiers are struck in the head by stray arrows, and Andrew immediately shouts that it's an ambush as enemy troops emerge from the grass. He orders everyone to run, and the squad scatters. One soldier is pinned down while Andrew is captured. Ingrid is stabbed through the chest and turns to see enemy soldiers surrounding them from every direction. From what he can sense, they're completely encircled. Meanwhile, Enri keeps running as a crossbow is aimed at his back. Ingrid hears it and realizes Jackson's listening technique really does work, allowing him to dodge the bolt fired from behind. But soon, the battlefield becomes overwhelmed with noise. There are too many sounds for him to process, making it impossible to separate them anymore. Even so, the technique still helps, until a barrage of spears comes flying in and impales him. Considering they walked straight into an ambush, there was never any easy way to avoid it. He remembers trying to warn Andrew beforehand, only for Andrew to snap back and ask if he wanted to lose his head. That was when Ingrid understood that nobody would listen to him. Maybe the only option was finding a way to escape on his own. Once again, he desperately warns everyone that it's an ambush and they have to run, but every escape route is blocked by more enemy soldiers. Enri dies as well. Even so, Ingrid tells himself it's fine. He can always try another route because the time loops are still on his side. Then an enemy firing squad appears. A rain of arrows slams into his chest as nearly 20 crossbowmen catch him from the east and fill his body with bolts. He tries escaping north instead, only to run directly into a formation of spearmen. With arrows lodged throughout his body, he claws desperately at the dirt, dragging himself forward. Every time he avoids one threat, another group appears to cut him off. Their green uniforms make it obvious this entire ambush was carefully planned. Ingrid begins wondering what could possibly be so important in a place like this. As he continues crawling, he spots a fire in the distance along with a flag. Before he can get any closer, his head is severed in a single, clean swing. As his blood spills onto the ground, his final thought is about whatever they're hiding there. The loop resets once again to Andrew, announcing that they'll cross the field and capture the enemy. Ingrid has heard those words countless times already. Every single time they enter the field, they die, meaning the enemy is clearly protecting something. He has to find out what it is. If he simply stops investigating, the loop will end and he won't have to keep dying. Henry calls out to him, snapping him back to reality. And the protagonist realizes that avoiding this mission altogether would finally end the loop. Even so, he decides he can't keep running away from this wall forever. Andrew calls over, asking what he's waiting for. One of the soldiers quietly tells Incred that Andrew may be a jerk, but he should cooperate because Andrew has problems of his own. Incred asks why he should, saying there's only so much stupidity he can tolerate from an idiot. Then he asks the soldier if he isn't tired of constantly sucking up to Andrew. That immediately sets the man off. He shoves past Incred and says he's done pretending. Andrew reaches for his sword and demands to know if Incred is refusing orders. Incred realizes he has to change the entire situation. Calmly, he replies that he isn't refusing orders. He's taking command instead. Andrew explodes with anger, while Incred points out that the soldiers who survive the longest are himself, that other soldier, and Unri. The scar-faced soldier looks every bit as dangerous as he appears. He's clearly the strongest person here, yet he stays beside Andrew like a bodyguard. Andrew draws his sword and says Incred can take command if he defeats him, then tells him to draw his weapon. The protagonist points out that an ordinary soldier wouldn't have someone protecting him. His stance also reveals proper training, meaning Andrew must come from a wealthy noble family. But if that were true, he wouldn't be so desperate to earn results. So Incred concludes that Andrew must be a fallen noble. Andrew fires back, saying the protagonist's poor skills combined with his high rank make him look like a spoiled brat surviving on his family's reputation. Incred replies that no matter who Andrew is, he can no longer follow his orders. Andrew insists they're nothing alike because he has a mission he absolutely must accomplish. Incred tells him to stop talking and come at him already, mocking him for acting tough when he's actually an easy opponent. The taunt immediately provokes Andrew, who charges straight at him. Incred knows this fight would normally be difficult, but Andrew is underestimating him, and anger always leads to mistakes. Andrew thrusts his sword toward Incred's head, but the protagonist calmly knocks the attack aside with his hand. He knows a reckless strike is the perfect opening. As Andrew's arm is thrown off balance, he realizes too late that he made a mistake. Incred steps in and drives a powerful punch into his stomach, making Andrew gasp before collapsing to his knees, coughing violently. Both Andrew and his bodyguard are stunned that a single punch was enough. They had always believed Incred was weak. The protagonist declares that from this moment onward he's leading the squad and asks if anyone objects. Hank is left speechless, while Andrew's bodyguard quietly looks between the two before glancing at the frustrated Andrew. After letting out a sigh, he accepts it. Incred says this is only the beginning. As they continue through the field, the others wonder what exactly the protagonist is planning. Suddenly, Incred asks Henry what his dream is. Henry is caught completely off guard and asks why he wants to know, but eventually admits he dreams of marrying a beautiful woman who owns a flower shop. Incred tells him he'll have to stay alive first. He asks another soldier who says he recently became a father. The protagonist gives him the same answer. If he wants to keep being a father, he has to survive. He continues asking the others. One man dreams of opening his own business. Another simply wants to return home. Finally, Incred asks Andrew, who says he wants to fulfill his mother's wish by restoring House Gardner. Incred tells them that every one of them has a dream, and if they want to achieve those dreams, they must all leave this place alive. He stops and declares that they aren't just going to try, they're going to make sure as many men as possible survive. His words catch everyone off guard. He explains that he needs each of them to think for themselves, because nothing drives a person harder than the desire to stay alive. The enemy will appear soon, and his plan is to break straight through them. Pointing into the tall grass, he orders Henry to fire an arrow there at head level. Henry insists there's nothing there, but Incred cuts him off and orders him to shoot anyway. Henry releases the arrow, and it buries itself directly into the face of a hidden enemy soldier. The enemy immediately shouts that they've been ambushed, leaving Henry and the others completely stunned. Incred draws his sword and orders Andrew to stay close behind him. Andrew grits his teeth and rushes forward. The protagonist realizes he was wrong before. If they want the advantage, they have to find the enemy first and strike before they're discovered. He drives his blade through one soldier's back before immediately turning toward another target. The enemy panics, yelling for everyone to kill them. Andrew thrusts his sword straight through another man's throat. Incred orders everyone to use the confusion to eliminate as many enemies as possible. He deliberately brought Andrew because he knew the bodyguard would follow as well. Just as an enemy attacks from behind, the bodyguard instantly decapitates him before cutting the body apart. Incred knows this is their greatest opportunity. As he slices another enemy's arm clean off, he notes that the enemy force has already been reduced from 12 men to 8. The remaining soldiers begin closing in, but at that moment, the rest of Incred's squad arrives. He orders them to wipe out every last enemy. The squad charges through the towering grass. With visibility so poor, the enemy struggles to track their movements. There's a reason Incred found them first. Just then, the panther races past once again. One enemy panics and swings at the beast, but Incred attacks from the side and stabs him through the stomach. The protagonist finally realizes what happened during the previous loop. The enemy had been chasing that same panther, which accidentally led them to his squad. This time, however, they completely miss the ambush because they're too focused on hunting the beast. Now that everything is finally going according to plan, Incred refuses to let the panther die. Moments later, Henry reports that the battle is over. Andrew breathes heavily while his bodyguard calmly wipes the blood from his sword. Incred tells everyone they're moving out immediately, while the panther silently watches them from behind. After losing one man, only 6 soldiers remain. Even after repeating this loop so many times, the protagonist still can't save everyone. Still, this is the highest number of survivors he's ever managed, and he intends to push even further. Soon, they encounter an enemy guard standing watch. Incred swiftly cuts off his head. Thanks to the countless loops, he already knows where the enemy forces are positioned and exactly how many there are. If they continue straight ahead, 30 crossbowmen will slaughter them, so they need to turn right instead. The spearmen who chase them down in every loop must also be dealt with quickly, or they'll delay the entire escape. By launching quick ambushes before immediately pulling back, the squad gradually slips through the enemy encirclement. Andrew kills one of the enemy soldiers, but his bodyguard warns him that he's pushing himself too hard. Once darkness falls, finding a way out will become much more difficult, so they have to escape before sunset. Incred simply tells everyone to keep moving. When one of the soldiers asks why they're heading even deeper into enemy territory, the protagonist replies that this is the correct path and refuses to listen to any complaints. All they have to do is follow him. The bodyguard clearly doesn't like that answer. Suddenly, Henry is shocked when the man raises his sword and points it directly at Incred. That's where this part ends. After hundreds of brutal time loops, our hero is finally strong enough to challenge Mitch again. But can he destroy the real flag and break the enemy's deadly spell? We'll find out in the next part. If you enjoyed this recap, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment your favorite moment. See you in the next one.